All right, let's get into it. I'm Vincent Navarro. I'm the Curator for Special Collections and Performing Arts here at the University of Maryland. Welcome to our campus, those of you who have come from afar today. Right now I'm going to introduce our Associate Dean for Collections to provide some welcome and opening remarks, Daniel Mack.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Hornbeck Library at the University of Maryland. On behalf of the administration of the University Libraries, I would like to welcome you to the Saving College Radio Symposium. We've been very excited this whole year about the wonderful exhibit on college radio that Laura Schnitker and her colleagues put together. And it looks like you're going to have a bunch of interesting conversations about college radio today. Last October 1st, President Barack Obama made remarks about College Radio Day, which last year was October 1st. The president said, by empowering students to add their voices and opinions to the airwaves and connecting listeners to new ideas and artists, college radio fosters creativity, promotes emerging musicians, and serves as a platform for students to engage with one another. I think that pretty much sums it up. College radio is a vital part of the student experience on college campuses. The radio stations that serve campuses are vital components of the intellectual and cultural community of the university. The legacy of these radio stations offer unique insights into the cultural climate of both their campuses and of the larger communities of which those campuses are part. University libraries can play a key role in protecting, preserving, and making accessible this unique legacy. Here in the Special Collections and University Archives at the University of Maryland, we have extensive collections in broadcasting, including in college radio. We do a lot of work with not just the preservation, but the description and accessibility of media in all formats, of papers, of other materials, including artifacts relating to college radio. This symposium today demonstrates the need for ongoing dialogue on the subject of college radio culture and history. Again, by preserving a unique voice primarily of students, college radio provides a type of insight into campus culture and campus history that's not available from any other source. Some of the questions I think you'll be discussing today include things like what are some of the challenges in sustaining student-run stations, and what are some of the challenges for preserving complete archival collections from college radio stations. You have a great lineup of speakers and moderators today. I'm very happy on the part of the library's administration to welcome you to this symposium, and I think that we should begin by thanking everybody who participated in arranging this symposium and who worked on the exhibit, beginning with Dr. Laura Schnitker. So thank you and welcome.
So it's my great pleasure to moderate this morning's panel on college radio culture, especially as I've performed with bands and chamber groups at a variety of college radio stations and independent freeform radio stations around the country for over 20 years at this point. These stations hold a special place in the hearts of all independent musicians and musicians who operate outside of the mainstream. This morning, our presenters, Jennifer Waits, Kip Lornell, and Tori Kerr, will focus on college radio stations, past and present, and their ongoing relevance to both on-campus and their larger communities. Each speaker will present and take questions following their presentation. Our keynote speaker for this morning is Jennifer Waits. Jennifer is a writer and radio scholar based in San Francisco. She got her start in college radio as a student at Haverford College's carrier current station, WHRC, in 1986, and she has been a regular DJ and volunteer at 3 other college radio stations since that time. In 2008, she started the blog Spinning Indie in order to bring more attention to the culture of college radio. In 2009, she co-founded Radio Survivor, where she continues to report on many different radio topics. Jennifer has a master's degree in popular culture studies and has written about radio, music, youth culture, and pop culture for a number of publications and websites. Let's welcome Jennifer.
I could not be more excited to be here. This is pretty much my dream sort of presentation. So this is at Haverford College. I want to let you know that I've spent actually the entire week so far immersed in college radio culture, so this is kind of a culmination of a dream week for me. I came in early and went to Philadelphia and saw a bunch of college stations there, and then spent some time at the Haverford College campus digging through the archives and climbing around in the attics of buildings trying to find former station locations, and people had no idea, oh, there was a station in this building, and I didn't even think there was anything in the attic. So I'm excited about the entire day because I think it's going to give me more fodder as I try to piece together the history of radio at Haverford, which I'm particularly passionate about. So huge thanks to Laura for inviting me to come here. I know this has been at least a year in the making, so it's exciting. So the reason that I'm here today is because I'm obsessed with college radio. I am unabashed about that, and like was mentioned, I've been a regular DJ at 4 different stations and still have a weekly show. Currently I'm at KFJC, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's at Foothill College, which is a community college, and I have a weekly music show there. In the last 6 years, it's been sort of my mission to bring more attention to college radio, but also try to build connections between stations. And when I started writing about college radio regularly in 2008, I was in large part inspired by the dearth of published information about college radio. There's not much out there in the popular press. There's not much out there in the academic press. It was really kind of a wide open field for me to start writing about and digging into. And despite the fact that there are probably more than 1,500 college radio stations, there's just not much attention being given to them. And that number is growing, by the way. So the fact that not much has been written about college radio really doesn't imply a lack of relevance to our culture. College radio is deeply connected with campus life, the music industry, subcultures, social movements, and with innovations in technology. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, I will have inspired each of you to think a little bit differently about college radio and about the myriad ways that college radio has influenced the broader culture. Although some people might think that college radio exists at the periphery in isolated basements and, hidden attics with peeling paint, it's simply not the case. College radio stations have been intertwined with so many different aspects of culture since the very early days, which has been nearly 100 years at this point. College radio has been a pioneer in broadcasting since the very beginning, and in particular, I'm saddened by the fact that that isn't known by more people, that these contributions of students aren't recognized. College radio stations have helped spark changes in the commercial music in the commercial radio industry and in commercial music and the music industry in general. And beyond technology and music, student radio stations have also been some of the first stations to break news on campus, especially before the internet. When I was in college, people found out about the Challenger explosion from hearing the campus radio station in the cafeteria. And many people found out about JFK's assassination from their college radio station. Stations have been enmeshed with cultural movements, including the free speech movement and student protests. And often student radio stations are some of the biggest campus groups. Today at Wellesley College, apparently their college radio station is the biggest campus organization. So even though I first became involved with college radio a few decades ago, and there I am, it wasn't until recently that I realized the importance of its rich history, and I became focused on learning more about college radio history in general. So way back in the 80s, when I was a music-loving 18-year-old, I sought out my campus station at Haverford College because I wanted to be more immersed in music culture. I didn't necessarily want to talk on the air. I didn't want to be a professional DJ or go into the music industry. I just wanted to be around people who liked music. So within a few years, I was co-music director at WHRC AM Carrier Current. So you could only hear it on campus. It was primetime shows were mealtime in the dining center because we were piped in to the left side of the dining center, not the right side. No. Sometimes cafeteria workers would turn off the speakers, so you would realize at the end of your show that nobody heard it. So it was definitely small time. As music director, I begged labels to send us music, tried to make us seem more important than we were. Got some cool perks, like I got to go to New York City for the first time to go to CMJ, which was very exciting. And we all made fake radio station staff IDs for the occasion. And it worked, even though it had a handwritten ID on it. But the 80s, it was a different time. So we went to clubs, saw bands. So clearly at that point, I had been bitten by the college radio bug. At the time, I had no idea about the rich history of the station. I was just focused on, this is what we're doing right now. I was fascinated by some of the vintage records in the library, which some of them you might be able to see there. And I often use them for mixing. But I didn't really think much about who my college radio predecessors were at Haverford. Years after graduation, I suddenly became much more interested in the history. I went back to campus for a reunion to find the station in disarray. There were unconfirmed rumors about records getting sold off to fund a Roots concert, and somebody told me this week he heard rumors about somebody skipped off to grad school with the money from the records. So who knows what happened. But I saw for myself that the station was in sad shape. And initially I got really angry and started trying to blame people, I guess, and felt like, I'd toiled for these records and now they've disappeared, and what's happened to the legacy of the station. But that initial anger I had actually turned into curiosity. So I became interested in finding more about Haverford's radio history and why didn't I know about it, what had happened in the 15 years after I'd left, but also what was the deal with the entire history of radio at Haverford College. So since then, I've been spending a lot of time investigating and I've been able to piece together much of the station's history. I learned that the first radio station launched at Haverford in 1923 and was built entirely by students. In fact, a freshman was really the mastermind, and he went on to have fame and helped develop FM even. So he was a really talented scientist. So the station launched in 1923, and I found impressive press clippings about the station's international chess matches. So this is one of them where by Morse code, they actually had an international chess match with Oxford College. And so they got written up in the New York Times. I mean, it was a really big deal. They also did quiz shows by radio. So I learned all about that history from the 20s. And then I also learned about the rebirth of radio on campus in the 40s when on-campus carrier current broadcasting began. So I've heard from alumni since then about tales of nearly flunking out of school because the radio station took up so much time, about all the technical challenges of aging equipment. In the most active years, there could have been 100 students involved with the station. And I mean, it's amazing to think because at the time, maybe there were 100 students at Haverford, or 1,000 students at Haverford, so like 10% of the students were involved. And as I learned more about Haverford's radio history, and I'm still learning, I've not only become an accidental college radio historian, but I've also gained greater insight into the broader culture of college radio. And so one of the main things to note is that the history of student radio is not well documented. And we're going to hear a lot about that, I'm sure, today. And very few schools even archive materials related to the history of their college radio stations. So for that reason, I'm really excited to see the exhibit today, and I'm super impressed at the effort being undertaken. I write about college radio, and in part due to my obsession with the history of my own station, I always feel the need to learn more about the history of radio stations that I visit and profile. Unfortunately, I'm often frustrated by the lack of documentation of the history of most stations. Occasionally, I'll find some amazing station histories, but it's often the case that even the managers of student radio don't know the history of their own station, or even when it was founded, like basic things like that. And this week I visited several stations in Philadelphia where I actually knew a little bit more about their history. I mean, and granted, I'm obsessed, but I knew a little more about their history than they did. And that's not unusual. So to give some context for why college radio is important to the broader culture, I wanted to give you kind of a rundown of college radio's secret history. So ever since radio's early experimental days, there have been college students broadcasting from their campuses, often at the technological forefront of radio. Despite lack of funding, transient student populations, competing academic demands, passionate radio enthusiasts have persevered and created radio stations in a variety of guises. But in order to find stories about the history of college radio, you have to dig deep, piecing together tidbits from college radio websites, zines, archives, vintage yearbooks, old student newspapers, university archives, theses and dissertations, blogs, and firsthand accounts from alumni. Although an oft-repeated myth places the origins of college radio in the late 30s and early 1940s, I see this often. I'm reading something, college radio started in 1938. The advent of campus-only stations was around that time, but college radio dates back even further. Early wireless experiments were taking place on campuses in the late 1800s, and that would have mostly been by professors and academic departments. A professor at Beloit set up an early wireless station in 1910, and the first experimental radio license in the United States was actually issued to St. Joseph's College in Philadelphia in 1912. I finally got to visit there, and because I was so intrigued by that. By 1917, University of Wisconsin Station was broadcasting music over the airwaves, followed by the Human Voice in 1919. The earliest licensed college radio stations arrived by the 1920s. Hugh Richard Slaughton's early history of the early days of college radio and public broadcasting in the United States sheds light on many of these early pioneering stations and points out that during the early boom years of radio in the 1920s, colleges and universities were well represented. Although I can't definitively state which college radio station appeared first, and I've tried, some of the earliest include Union College Station, WRUC in Schenectady, and they launched in 1920, and they still operate today. Their descendant FM station still operates today. So back to Haverford. In 1923, Haverford College radio station WABQ was built and launched by students. The AM commercial station predated electric phonographs, so most of the broadcasts at the very beginning of the station were of live performances, like live music from the studio or from a nearby theater. Before the station even launched, they were getting press because the students starting it were enmeshed in the burgeoning, it's kind of like the early days of the internet, so the amateur radio scene, in their publications, they were writing these excited articles about, students are about to launch a station, which was big news that it was actually students creating this AM station. And then, as I mentioned, the international chess match brought them even more attention. There were yearbook accounts that joked that the station was getting more press than all the sports teams combined, which, on campus was probably like, yeah. In 1924, the station had 20 members, which was nearly 10% of the population of Haverford. It was like a school of around 200 men at the time. And so it was one of the largest clubs on campus, and the powerful AM station was said to be heard for 1,000 miles in every direction. And I just found this picture a couple days ago in a student newspaper at Haverford, and I was really excited because I'd read about these descriptions of this unusual aerial that was going up on the top of the science building at Haverford. So they had this really crazy tower and antenna apparatus that apparently lived on even after the station went away. So this was a research success to finally find this picture, and I'm really excited that I could show it to you. So in 1925, there were around 124 radio stations operated by colleges and universities. Many of these stations were short-lived as the number decreased to less than 30 by 1932. Some of the challenges along the way included competition from commercial stations, changes to radio licensing regulations, and frequency assignments. So sometimes stations were having to share airtime. At the beginning, things were unregulated, so AM stations could blast for 1,000 miles, and things started to change. So within that environment, unlicensed campus-only stations started to grow in popularity in the late 30s and early 40s, which often are referred to as gas pipe networks. And it started out with students maybe running lines from their room to another room so that they could hear music across their dorm. And then they figured out in the late 30s there were Brown University students who started connecting their stations together via these lines. And then they ran wires through steam pipes so that they could broadcast to the entire dorm. So as carrier current broadcasting expanded, stations started using buildings' electrical systems as an antenna to transmit to nearby radios. The explosion of these carrier current stations played a big role in the development of the intercollegiate broadcasting system, which had their first conference in 1940, and they still exist today as an organization. By 1945, the FCC made allowances for educational radio by allocating 20 FM frequencies for non-commercial use, and by 1947, there were 38 non-commercial educational licenses issued. And FM proved to be a boon for college radio, and initially it was kind of the Wild West, and so colleges were willing to take a chance on FM, and it ended up putting them on the map as a source for more progressive alternative music by the latter half of the 20th century. College radio stations were some of the pioneers who took a chance on the new FM band and were intertwined with the growth of FM and freeform radio. Gerald Drawhorn is currently working on a project to document college radio's influence on freeform culture or freeform radio and its connections to activism and to the free speech movement and other student movements of the 60s. And he's looking into the history of radio at the UC Davis station, KDVS, and a Sacramento State station, KERS. And he talks about how many of the people involved with those stations went on to freeform commercial stations. So that history of freeform FM radio should really be connected with college radio. Around this time, there were also some fascinating radio experiments, like in the 60s and 70s, including a live on-air acid test at the San Francisco State Station, led by Ken Kesey himself. So, he encouraged listeners to take some LSD simultaneously. That happened in 1966, and I don't know if there's a connection, but at Haverford in the 70s, apparently the walls of the station were painted purple and there were cartoon sheep. So, there was definitely this kind of psychedelic influence going on around that time. A lot of scholars have looked at the 80s and 90s and the influence of college radio culture on music and punk rock. It became a place where underground bands, started to break and move into the mainstream. And then the growing popularity of formerly alternative music also created tension between college stations that wanted to define themselves outside of commercial culture, leading some stations to dig further underground. In the 90s, I looked at one such example in which a station instituted an indie-only policy where they only added music by independent record labels, and you couldn't even add anything that was from a label distributed by you couldn't add music distributed by a major label. It all had to be independent music. They figured that there's so much underground music that we should be championing that. We don't need to support the majors. But that policy also created some tension among staff who just wanted to do an all-80s show. And they're like, but you're restricting my freedom. Why do we have to be so underground? Why can't we just be free? So that's another area where, you can see cultural tensions taking place at a station. Nick Rubin has explored that idea further, arguing that despite alternative leanings, college radio stations often utilize commercial practices in their interactions with the record industry. So, many college radio stations report their charts to industry publications. They work with promoters. And those tensions between alternative music and mainstream culture have also played out within the confines of a campus itself. As I was digging through the station memos from St. Mary's College, KSMC in Moraga, California, from the 80s, they gave me a binder full of stuff. I was excited. I found material that spoke to a campus debate about the appropriateness of playing punk rock music at the station. So the dean of students in the memo called for a ban on punk music over the school airwaves in 1982, as was not deemed appropriate for a Christian school. Sometimes, apparently they can play punk now, but short-lived controversy. And that's KSMC in that picture, like a more recent picture. Sometimes stations at conservative or religious institutions also have to adhere to stricter rules placed by their campuses. So metal-oriented WSOU at Seton Hall, although they have a lot of freedom to play heavy music, they still need to monitor lyrics and make sure that they're not playing anything blasphemous. By the 1990s, college radio stations were some of the first to take their broadcasts online, and probably some of the first to even have websites, frankly. Georgia Tech station REC and University of North Carolina station WXYC purport to be the very first radio stations of any kind to go to have internet streams, and that was in 1994. Through the internet, they began to reach new and wider audiences, and it's also notable that they began streaming before many commercial radio stations even had a website. So, oops. There's REC. Ever since the early days of radio, stations were also experimenting with remote broadcasts. I find lots of references to sporting events that were broadcast in the very early days at Haverford and other places. In 1994, the station where I DJ, KFJC, did a live remote broadcast from South by Southwest in Austin, which was thousands of miles away from where our station was. So people at the station figured out how to actually connected with NPR and managed to use one of their satellites to obtain the broadcast. So back in San Francisco, we played some concerts from Austin, and then 20 other stations, college, community, and public radio stations picked up that broadcast and played it. So that was really early on that happened. That was in 1994. And then in 1996, KFJC went to Brixton, England, and did a live broadcast as our first international live remote. In the 2000s, stations broadened their reach across multiple forms of media, whereas in the past it might have been common for a station to broadcast terrestrially, maybe publish a paper magazine. After the turn of the 21st century, many college stations are operating across numerous platforms. Stations may or may not broadcast over AM or FM, but are very likely to stream online. Blogs, podcasts, radio listening apps, webcams, chat functionality, video features, and social media are common at many college radio stations. In 2008, using some of this new technology, KFJC aired a live FM remote broadcast from Tokyo, as well as a live video stream on the station's website. In addition to all of these methods for delivering content, today's college radio stations are also producing their own events. In some cases are running recording studios, record labels. Many have large news teams and are on the scene when there's news to report. Even back in the days of campus-only radio, college stations were often the first to report breaking news. And recently, KDVS reporters at Davis were reporting on, this horrific pepper spray incident where students were sprayed by campus police. Today, there are probably around 1,500 college radio stations with more on the way. The recent low-power FM application window saw close to 100 college radio or college or university applicants, with at least 40 granted so far. So clearly there's still interest, which is fabulous. But despite college radio's storied past, there's still plenty of mythology, half-truths, and questionable documentation out there. Many stations purport to be the first at this or that, and in-depth portraits of stations are very rare. That provides plenty of opportunities for college radio historians, stations, and archivists to help piece together a more complete story about college radio's important role in culture and on campus. And if you look at the individual case profiles, or if you look at individual case studies, you start to get a better picture of just how diverse college radio is. As I've mentioned, throughout college radio's nearly 100-year history, the stories of individual stations have been rarely documented. There are some people that have looked at a few stations in depth. There's an exhaustive history of the history of radio at Beloit College, and they have a website set up where you can look at bits and pieces of that. Ethereal Messages is the text that was put together. And there's a searchable digital collection on the Beloit website. And then Lou Houston put together a zine called Saving WRKU, or Finding WRKU, that captures the colorful history of radio at Kutztown. And I think I got it from a zine archive. That's how I found it when I was able to read it. So it was a nice intersection with zine culture. And then more recently, Tim Brooks put together this pretty heavy tome. This is all about the history of radio at Dartmouth College, where he went. And then WTUL at Tulane, they worked with their archives, and the library website has an entire WTUL collection that you can search through. And then there's some alumni that have also put together sites. Aaron Reed was an alum of Boston University, and he went through the archives kind of like I've done, where he's dug through old student newspapers and yearbooks and put together a history on one of his sites. And then I have to give huge credit to Haverford College. Their special collections department had the foresight to start collecting boxes of material related to Haverford College radio history. And I'm not sure what prompted that, but there are boxes of meeting minutes, old radio dramas from the 40s, scripts, and tons of materials in there that I haven't even fully gone through. Letters, so we'd have a less complete picture of the station's history if they hadn't had the foresight to start archiving those materials. So other stations have put together special exhibits, events, gallery shows, broadcasts, and reunions to honor station anniversaries. Sometimes the festivities have resulted in special websites and increased press coverage that helps to explain and promote a station's history. Since 2008, I've been taking field trips to college stations all over the world, and in the process, I've been attempting to paint these mini portraits of stations, of the wide range of stations I've visited. I've written up more than 50 visits so far. Some stations are deeply tied to broadcasting communications programs and limit participation to students, and others exist far away from the school curriculum, operating like student clubs. Some stations are limited to students, whereas others welcome faculty and community members, including high school students. And the ways that stations broadcast are wide-ranging, with some broadcasting to wider metropolitan areas over huge FM, with lots of power beaming out to the city, where others are still campus only, and some still operate on campus television cable networks. Some do low power AM or FM to the campus. Most have some sort of online stream. Others are on AM, HD, TuneIn, and various apps, including iHeartRadio, on a variety of platforms and devices. At one point, there was a college radio station that you could call a phone number and listen to it, too. So clearly it's important for me to cast more light on the history of college radio, but why should it matter to anyone else besides me? First of all, it should matter to stations themselves. Existing college radio stations can learn a lot from their predecessors. Challenges might not seem so daunting when you realize that, for the past 30 years, the same things have been happening over and over again. Additionally, mapping out a station's history can help build connections to alumni, and that can help you in a lot of ways. It can help run ideas off them, get some advice, but it can also lead to monetary support. By understanding the history of a station, it also shows that participants are proud of their station's ongoing legacy, which is a good thing. Additionally, college radio history should matter to university. I'm pleased to see that some schools are starting to develop archives and collections related to student activities like college radio. These materials can be helpful for school publicity, student recruitment, for significant anniversary celebrations, and for alumni outreach and reunions. And maybe after my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm helping to plan for an upcoming Haverford reunion. I talked to several students this week who indicated that the presence of a college radio station on campus helped to cement their decision to attend a certain school. So, colleges should know that maybe put the college station on the tour. It's much easier for schools to tell a story about their student radio station if they understand the history. And finally, college radio history should matter to all of us. Often college radio is left out of the broader conversations about radio. Its pioneers are absent from mainstream radio histories, and college radio's ongoing exploits are rarely discussed outside of localized station communities. there have been moments when college radio has been the spotlight, like when bands championed by college radio break into the mainstream culture. But that one example represents a small fraction of college radio's overall influence. So, obviously there are challenges, and we'll hear more about this later today, but documenting college radio can be a challenge. It's volunteer-run organizations with transient staff. Most college stations don't have a great deal of institutional memory, nor is there time to devote to archival projects. Space is at a premium, so many things get thrown out. Some universities are very supportive of their college radio stations and are happy to provide archival assistance, but other schools aren't. And you hear rumors about dumpsters, getting loaded up with materials, radio artifacts going in the trash. And often stations are moving, so this is what happens. The station moves, and then a bunch of things get dumped out. Additionally, it's often hard to find where college radio documents even are. Some materials are in campus libraries, others are stashed in dusty radio station file cabinets, and even more ephemera is in the hands of station alumni. Many college radio participants might not even realize that certain items are worth saving, such as stickers, program guides, station newsletters, meeting minutes, t-shirt designs, vintage equipment, and various pieces of audio like air checks, station promos, PSAs, recordings of lectures and live events housed on cassettes, carts, hard drives. I even saw old floppy disks yesterday, or a few days ago, CDs, reel-to-reel tapes. And even the history of a radio station's role on campus can be hard to track down. And at Haverford, there have been many stations over the years in many different buildings, and figuring out where exactly stations were located can be challenging. And like I mentioned, I was up in an attic with somebody in the music department. She's like, I don't know if a radio station was ever here. And so at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about my disappointment over the changes that I saw at my former college radio station when I returned to campus for the first time. However, after digging into the history of radio at Haverford, I have a much deeper understanding of the ebb and flow of college radio. With an ever-changing student population, rapidly changing technologies, and varying level of interest from year to year, it's not surprising that stations can be radically different within just a few years. Even a station's role on campus can change. One year it might have a strong group of leaders. Another year it may have a less engaged staff. Interactions with broader campus can change. Maybe one year you have deep connections with other student media organizations. You might broadcast into campus buildings so people can hear you. But another year you might have an unsupportive student government and face funding crises. Some stations have lost valuable real estate when other groups started to notice, like, oh, you seem to have a lot of room over there, so maybe we can use part of your record library. So after reading newspaper and yearbook accounts and talking to alumni at Haverford, I began to hear similar stories of station decline and rebirth across the decades. Equipment was always breaking down. People who created the technology had often graduated, and this still happens. So when the technology fails, the person who created it is long gone, so there are challenges there. And as I read station histories from other campuses, the same exact themes emerged. Yet despite the broken transmitters, flooded record libraries, hacked computer systems, lightning-damaged equipment, college radio stations continue to evolve and persevere. They regroup, rebuild, and subsequent generations of students continue to get bitten by the radio bug like I did and like many of my predecessors did. So thank you very much. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Take questions now for Jennifer? Or comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Rafael. I'm from Brazil. I'm in radio for several. My question is just, I'm curious about you mentioned that the college station began as a public broadcast. I want to know a little more about, just if you can explain a little more about the role of the college radio as a broadcast activity, public institution, or if it's connected to, it's not connected to any institutions, how can it be public?
I'm not sure what you mean by public, like public radio?
Yeah, you mentioned that it would be a public broadcast. In the beginning, it's connected to it, it's not private.
Well, I mean, in the beginning, like in the 20s, the licensing was really different. So the government was licensing the stations to the university or to the student radio club. So I'm not sure if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And college radio stations, sometimes they're licensed to a private group, like a student group. Sometimes they're licensed to the university. But it's generally nonprofits if it's a licensed station.
That's why it's public.
Yeah.
Yeah, this would be like the broad definition of public as opposed to a commercial
Yeah.
money-making venture. Especially a lot of the earliest, I mean, like you said in your excellent kind of synopsis history, a lot of the earliest radio stations in the country grew out of college and experimental programs, and they were, I mean, they were nonprofit just because everybody was nonprofit. Everything was experimental at that time. There was no commercial radio as we understand it today until probably the 1920s.
Although I guess, to complicate things, so at Haverford, the first AM station was commercial.
Just to
Yeah.
mess with us.
Because, and probably all of those AM stations that started in the 20s were commercial. And then the carrier current stations on campus, they were unregulated, unlicensed. And so I think a lot of them aired commercials. And a lot of the reason some of those college radio stations came together to form networks was to, I think, help get funders and to get commercial interests to maybe advertise across a group of stations. So yeah, it's never simple. College, the more you look into it, it's more complicated than it seems. And even today, there are commercial college radio stations, some of whom are also nonprofit.
Yeah, I mean, you can take advertising and still be nonprofit, because you're plowing everything back. And interestingly, you touched on this, part of the reason for the big drop-off in college radio stations was that because so many of them got into the game early, they got really good, frequency assignments.
Yeah.
And then when people figured out you could make money, they either pulled strings to get the FCC to change their assignments, like you alluded to, or basically bought out the college stations to put commercial stations in their place because...
Yeah, and I didn't explain... So the students who started WABQ at Haverford in 1923, in 1927, as they were nearing graduation, the students decided to sell the station to a commercial radio group because I think at the time, in 1927, it's fascinating to read about commercial radio in 1927 because it feels very much in a way like some of the crisis that happened the past few years with non-commercial radio and some groups who have bought up student-run college station licenses. It was very similar. So commercial groups were like, hey, Haverford College, you can broadcast 1,000 miles in every direction. We really want your powerful station. And so the students were graduating and, they were tempted by this offer. Nobody was around who could help run the station after they left. So they sold off the license to a commercial group in Philadelphia. So that station, its descendant station is, I think, a CBS station in Philadelphia today.
So is that because it was a private group?
It was students. It was owned by the Haverford Radio Club.
So it wasn't the university itself? Yeah.
No, and then the money, I think, went back into the coffers, and so it was used later to buy equipment and stuff.
There was a question in the back.
I have a question. You said you've been sort of touring college stations. How many have you been to again at this point?
I've been to at least 50 stations. I've also visited some commercial stations, some community stations, high school stations, even family radio, if any of you remember the apocalypse when Harold Camping was predicting the end of the world. I got to meet him.
Independent culture was sort of marked by regional differences, and I think there's a bit of a feeling with the internet that there's more of a monoculture within American independent music and culture. Do you feel like you're seeing regional differences still in terms of musically or politically or weirdness? anything like that? Is that still present in your?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think college stations are connected with their local scene, whatever that might be. And I was just at the GW station yesterday, and they were talking about that, how the station really reflects the school and the culture of being in DC, and their DC-focused music shows, and the political active student body is really reflected in their programming. So yeah, I think so. I think stations do still reflect their cultures. And for me, so the second station that I was a DJ at was in Bowling Green, Ohio, and I moved there from San Francisco to go to grad school, and I was so terrified because I was used to living in San Francisco where I had access to like all of this live music culture. So I went to the radio station like the first day on campus because I wanted to stay in touch with music. And at Bowling Green in the 90s, the station was so enmeshed with the local band scene, and it was a pretty conservative town and campus, and the station was so vital for all of those people because we had a place to be. And I think that made me realize more than anything how unique each station can be and, you know, continues to be today.
Time for one more question.
I was wondering, since you've toured so many college stations and you've interacted with, with students at all different types of colleges and universities, is there any sort of like single problem that seems to completely envelop all of these stations, or seems to affect all of them? Is there like a singular issue that seems to affect them?
Everybody always talks about, this year we're really trying to promote our station more. Everybody. And I feel like there's also, especially at schools where it's a really transient student population and you might not have consistent community volunteers or staff, they always talk about, this year we're rebuilding the station. So I think I feel like there's this cyclical, like you might have a very enthusiastic staff one year and then they graduate, and then another enthusiastic group needs to kind of take up the mantle. So those are definitely two common themes. I don't know that I've been to many stations where people are like, yeah, everyone on campus knows about us.
Well, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.